The Roman Empire has given history some of its most recognizable names: Caesar, Augustus, Nero, figures so large that their stories have never stopped being told. But once in a while, history produces a man who stands apart, not because of his name, his bloodline, or his fortune, but because of what he built entirely on his own terms. Vespasian was that kind of man. He was born Titus Flavius Vespasianus on the 17th of November in the year 9 AD in a small village called Flavian, located to the northeast of Rome in the heart of central Italy. There was nothing about the place and nothing about the family into which he was born that suggested this child would one day rule the greatest empire the Western world had ever seen. Flavian was not a city of power or prestige. It was a quiet corner of Italy, the kind of place that produced farmers and soldiers rather than senators and emperors. Yet it was here that the future emperor drew his first breath, and it was to this same humble region that he would return at the end of his life. His family belonged to the gens Flavia, a Roman clan of equestrian rank. To understand what that means, it helps to understand how Roman society was structured. At the very top sat the patricians, the ancient aristocratic families of Rome whose bloodlines stretched back centuries and who dominated the Senate, the law courts, and the highest offices of state. Below them were the equestrians, a class roughly equivalent to the gentry or knightly class of later European history, men of property and means, educated and capable of holding military and administrative positions, but without the ancestral prestige of the old Roman nobility. The gens Flavia had once shown promise of rising above the typical equestrian station. A member of the family had claimed the consulship, the highest political office of the Roman Republic, in 104 BC. For a family of their standing, that was a remarkable achievement. But history has a way of turning on families as quickly as it lifts them. Vespasian's grandfather had fought on the side of Pompeius Magnus in the civil war against Julius Caesar, a conflict that burned through the Roman world between 49 and 46 BC. When Caesar emerged victorious, those who had stood against him faced consequences. The gens Flavia were among those who suffered a demotion in Roman society, penalized for having backed the losing side. By the time Vespasian's father came of age, the family's position had fallen considerably from whatever heights it had briefly touched. Vespasian's father, also named Titus Flavius Sabinus, spent much of his working life in roles that were respectable but hardly distinguished. He served as a tax collector in the province of Asia, the region that corresponds to the western coast of modern-day Turkey, and later as a moneylender among the Helvetii, a people living in the area north of Italy that we now call Switzerland. These were not the careers of men destined for greatness, nor the kind of positions that opened doors in Rome's most powerful circles. For the father of a future emperor, the biography reads as almost deliberately unremarkable. His mother, however, was a different matter. Vespasia Pola came from an equestrian family that carried noticeably more weight than the gens Flavia. Her father had held the rank of prefect of the camp, which was the third most senior position within a Roman legion and carried with it real military authority and reputation. Her brother climbed higher still, eventually reaching the rank of senator. In the world Vespasian was born into, where family connections were the most reliable currency for advancement, his mother's side of the family offered something his father's could not: a thread, however slender, connecting the household to the upper levels of Roman public life. Vespasian would need every thread available to him. He spent his early years and received his education at Cosa, a town situated in the southwestern corner of Tuscany, on the shores of the Tyrrhenian Sea. It was his paternal grandmother, Tertulla, who oversaw his upbringing there, on her estate in the Tuscan countryside. The education she provided him would have followed the standard Roman curriculum of the time. Young men of the equestrian class were expected to develop competence in rhetoric, the art of persuasive public speaking that was essential for any career in law or politics. Grammar and philosophy were equally central to the formation of a Roman gentleman. He would also have spent considerable time with the foundational texts of Roman literature, including Virgil's Aeneid, an epic poem produced a generation before Vespasian was born, that told the story of Rome's mythological origins through the journey of the Trojan prince Aeneas. For any educated Roman, these texts were not merely literature. They were the shared cultural inheritance that defined what it meant to be Roman at all. Vespasian clearly held his time at Cosa in great affection. Long after his grandmother had died, long after his career had carried him far from Tuscany, he continued to return to the town. There is something telling about that. A man who would spend his life moving from province to province, from battlefield to battlefield, still found himself drawn back to the quiet Tuscan estate where he had grown up. Whatever Cosa gave him in those early years, it clearly stayed with him. Roman children were considered to have entered adulthood at around the age of 14, and so by the early 20s, A.D. Vespasian's formal education had concluded. He now faced the question that confronted every young man of equestrian background with ambitions: how to climb. In Rome, the path upward ran through two interconnected worlds, the military and the political, and the two were never truly separate. Military service was the gateway to political office. Political office opened the door to provincial commands. Provincial commands generated wealth, reputation, and influence, and wealth, reputation, and influence were what allowed a man to reach the next rung. Vespasian understood the structure of this system and began working his way through it. But before tracing that path, it is worth pausing to consider the world Vespasian was entering. Rome in the year 9 AD was an empire in fact, if not always in name. For centuries, the city had ruled itself as a republic, governed by the Senate and by magistrates, consuls, praetors, aediles, quaestors, who were elected for fixed terms and in theory subject to the will of the Roman people and the authority of the Senate. That system had produced extraordinary results. Rome had grown from a city-state in central Italy to the dominant power of the entire Mediterranean world. But the very success of that expansion had created the conditions for the Republic's collapse. Generals commanding vast armies in distant provinces had accumulated power that the Senate could not always contain. The 1st century BC had been consumed by a series of devastating civil wars as Rome's most powerful men, Cornelius Sulla, Gaius Marius, Julius Caesar, and Pompeius Magnus among them, fought each other for supremacy. Out of that long and bloody struggle, one man emerged with uncontested authority. Octavian, the adopted heir of Julius Caesar, defeated all rivals and in 27 BC reorganized the Roman state around his own person. He took the name Caesar Augustus and claimed the title of Princeps, meaning first citizen, though history has known him better by one of his other titles, Imperator, meaning commander, which is the word from which we derive the modern term emperor. Augustus ruled for more than 4 decades and gave Rome a stability it had not known in generations. He also left behind an empire built on the personality and authority of a single man, which meant that everything depended on the quality of whoever came next. Vespasian was only 4 years old when Augustus died in August of 14 AD. The man who succeeded him was his stepson Tiberius, and the reign of Tiberius cast a long shadow over the decades that followed. Tiberius has come down through history as a cautious and increasingly paranoid ruler who removed himself from Rome for long periods, effectively leaving the management of the capital and the court to Sejanus, the ambitious prefect of the Praetorian Guard. In the final years of his reign, Tiberius grew openly tyrannical, conducting purges and executions that poisoned the atmosphere of Roman public life. When he died in 37 AD, he was succeeded by Caligula, whose reign became a byword for excess, cruelty, and erratic behavior. Among the more celebrated anecdotes of his time in power was his alleged intention to appoint his favorite horse, Incitatus, to the office of consul. Whether or not the story is literally true, it captures the general perception of a man who had lost his grip on reality. Caligula was assassinated in 41 AD by officers of the Praetorian Guard, with the knowledge and approval of numerous senators. These events matter to Vespasian's story for a reason that goes beyond historical context. What the reigns of Tiberius and Caligula demonstrated was that the system Augustus had created was only as stable as the character of the man at its center. Augustus had governed with skill, restraint, and an acute understanding of how to manage the Senate, the legions, and the people of Rome simultaneously. His successors had not. And what that failure established, gradually but unmistakably, was the idea that the imperial title was not permanently secured by blood alone. A general with the right combination of military strength, political support, and personal credibility, could, under the right circumstances, claim it. That possibility would define the second half of Vespasian's life. For now, though, he was a young man of middling background, working his way through the lower ranks of Roman public service. He entered the military as a tribune of the soldiers, a mid-ranking officer position that placed him in command of several hundred men within a legion. A Roman legion typically numbering between 5,000 and 6,000 soldiers when its full complement of troops and auxiliary staff were counted. His posting was to Thrace, the region that corresponds today to European Turkey and parts of Bulgaria, and it was there that he received his first real experience of military command. From Thrace he moved to a quaestorship in the province of Crete in Cyrenaica, the Roman name for Libya. As quaestor he held responsibility for the province's military garrisons, though the posting was a modest one. Crete in Cyrenaica was not a wealthy or strategically vital province, and its small garrison was spread largely across desert forts in Cyrenaica, positioned to deter Berber raiders from attacking Roman settlements along the Mediterranean coast. It was steady, unglamorous work. But it was experience, and experience was what Vespasian was accumulating. His progression into formal Roman political life came next. The office of aedile, which placed its holder in charge of maintaining public buildings and organizing public events in Rome, was his target. He failed in his first attempts to secure the position, a reminder that in the competitive world of Roman elections, nothing was guaranteed, regardless of one's military record. He finally obtained it in 38 AD. The aedileship gave him something valuable beyond the administrative role itself. It placed him at the center of Roman civic life at a time when he needed to build relationships with the patrician class and the government of the emperor. It was exactly the kind of position that allowed a man of equestrian background to become known to people who mattered. During these same years, Vespasian also built his personal life. Sometime between 37 and 38 AD, he married Flavia Domitilla, the daughter of Flavius Liberalis, a quaestor's clerk from the Italian town of Ferentinum. It was not a politically ambitious match. Domitilla came from a humble background, and her family may have been descended from freed slaves. This was not the kind of marriage a man makes to advance his social position. It appears to have been a genuine personal choice, and the couple went on to have 3 children, a son named Titus, born in the final days of 39 AD, a daughter also named Domitilla, born some years later, and a second son born in October of 51 AD. He also maintained a relationship of a different kind with a woman named Antonia Canis. In Roman society, a contubernium was a form of informal union, typically between a free citizen and a slave or formerly enslaved person. Canis had been a freed slave who served as secretary and personal aide to Antonia Minor, the mother of the Emperor Claudius. She was, by all accounts, an exceptionally intelligent and capable woman, and her proximity to the imperial household gave her access and influence that extended well beyond her formal station. For Vespasian, a man of equestrian rank still working to establish himself, that connection was not insignificant. By the late 30s AD, Vespasian was a man in motion. He had served in the military, held provincial office, entered the political life of Rome, started a family, and cultivated connections that reached into the imperial court itself. None of it had come easily, and none of it had come quickly. He had no great name behind him, no powerful patron clearing the path, no inherited fortune to smooth the way. What he had was persistence, competence, and a clear-eyed understanding of how Roman advancement worked. He was climbing, slowly, steadily, one rung at a time. There is a particular kind of ambition that does not announce itself loudly. It does not rely on inheritance or on the goodwill of powerful men who have decided to lift someone up as a favor. It is quieter than that, and in many ways more relentless. It shows up every day, does the work that is in front of it, and waits for the moments when preparation and opportunity meet. Vespasian carried that kind of ambition. By the time the late 30s AD arrived, he had already moved through the lower ranks of Roman military and political life with steady, purposeful progress. Now the pace was about to quicken. His election as praetor, which came in either 39 or 40 AD, placed him in a position of genuine significance within the Roman political structure. The praetorship was the second most senior magistracy in the empire, sitting just below the consulship and well above the offices he had previously held. A praetor in Rome carried judicial responsibilities and real administrative authority. More importantly, the office placed Vespasian firmly within the upper tier of Roman public life, visible to the Senate, visible to the imperial court, and visible to the kinds of men whose support would be essential if he intended to keep climbing. He was almost certainly serving in that capacity when events in Rome took a dramatic turn in January of 41 AD. The Emperor Caligula, whose behavior had grown increasingly erratic and whose reign had become a source of genuine anxiety for the Senate and the Praetorian Guard alike, was assassinated by officers of the Guard with the knowledge and approval of numerous senior senators. The murder was swift and deliberate. What followed it was less orderly. The question of who would succeed Caligula had not been settled in advance, and in the chaos of the aftermath it was soldiers of the Praetorian Guard who found Claudius, the uncle of the murdered emperor, hiding behind a curtain in the palace and declared him the new ruler of Rome. Claudius was an unlikely emperor by almost any measure. He walked with a limp, was partially deaf, and had spent much of his life being dismissed by his own family as intellectually unserious, a judgment that history has largely overturned since Claudius proved to be a capable and thoughtful administrator. But the perception of weakness that surrounded him at the outset of his reign meant that he arrived on the throne with something to prove. That need to demonstrate his fitness to rule would soon create one of the most significant opportunities of Vespasian's career. For the moment, though, the change of emperor worked in Vespasian's favor in a more personal way. His long-standing relationship with Antonia Caenis, the freed slave who had served as secretary and aide to Antonia Minor, Claudius's own mother, now took on a different weight. Caenis was a woman of exceptional intelligence and deep familiarity with the inner workings of the imperial household. Her proximity to the new emperor's family gave Vespasian a connection to the court that men of his background rarely enjoyed. It did not guarantee him advancement, but it ensured that he was not invisible to the people who made decisions about who rose and who did not. What came next would make Vespasian visible to the entire empire. Augustus, the founder of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, had left instructions to his successors that the wisest course for Rome was to consolidate the enormous territory it already held, rather than to spend lives and treasure pursuing further conquests. The empire was vast, its borders long, and the challenges of administering what Rome already owned were considerable enough without adding new provinces to the burden. Tiberius had followed that counsel with reasonable consistency. Caligula, before his assassination cut short whatever plans he had been forming, had apparently been preparing an invasion of Britain. Claudius, inheriting both the throne and the plan, decided to follow through with it. His reasons were not purely strategic. Britain was known to contain valuable resources. The tin mines of Cornwall and the silver deposits further west represented genuine economic prizes for an empire that was always in need of metal for coinage and industry. The Romans had been trading with the peoples of southern Britain for generations and understood the wealth that lay in those western territories. Julius Caesar had made 2 expeditions to the island in the mid-50s BC, but neither had led to any lasting occupation. Augustus had drawn up invasion plans on multiple occasions without ever executing them. Britain had remained tantalizingly close and permanently unconquered for nearly a century of Roman imperial ambition. But for Claudius, the decision to invade was also personal. A man who had been underestimated his entire life, who had come to power through accident rather than design, needed a military triumph that would silence the doubters and establish his authority beyond question. Britain offered exactly that. A successful conquest of a territory that had resisted Roman ambition for 100 years would announce to the world that the limping, partially deaf emperor was a ruler worthy of the purple. In 43 AD, Claudius launched the invasion. The force assembled for the campaign was formidable. 4 Roman legions were committed to the operation, with an estimated 35,000 to 40,000 legionaries forming the core of the army, supported by a further 15,000 to 20,000 auxiliary troops drawn from across the empire. It was one of the largest military operations Rome had undertaken in a generation, and Vespasian, who had only recently served as praetor, was appointed as legate and given command of one of those 4 legions, the Legio II Augusta. The appointment was a significant statement of confidence. a legionary legate commanded thousands of men, was responsible for the discipline, logistics, and combat effectiveness of his unit, and operated in close coordination with the overall commander of the campaign. The overall command of the invasion fell to Aulus Plautius, an experienced general with the seniority and political standing the operation demanded. Claudius himself did not cross to Britain immediately, instead waiting in northern Gaul to be summoned once the initial landings had been secured and the campaign had reached a point at which his personal presence could be presented as a triumphant arrival rather than a risky adventure. The Roman army crossed the English Channel on hundreds of transport ships and landed in southern Britain, though the exact location of the landing remains a subject of historical debate. From the coast, they moved inland and north, advancing toward the River Thames, where a large settlement of the Celtic Britons occupied the ground on which central London stands today. The Celtic peoples of Britain had not been sitting idle while the Romans prepared their invasion. The tribes of southern Britain, among them the Atrebates, the Trinovantes, and the powerful Catuvelloni, understood that the Romans were coming and prepared to resist. What followed was a major engagement near the Thames that tested both sides before Roman discipline and numbers carried the day. With that battle won and Roman control established at the river crossing, Aulus Plautius pressed northeast toward Colchester, the foremost Celtic stronghold in southern Britain. Vespasian was given a different assignment. He was sent southwest into the territories that today make up Somerset, Dorset, and Cornwall, with the specific objective of securing the mining regions that had made Britain so attractive a target in the first place. What he accomplished there over the following months was militarily impressive by any standard. He fought his way through more than a dozen Celtic oppida, the fortified hilltop settlements that served as the towns and administrative centers of Celtic Britain, and brought each of them under Roman control. He also crossed to the Isle of Wight and secured its submission, before establishing his headquarters at what is now the city of Exeter, creating a forward base from which Roman authority in southwestern Britain could be administered and extended. The speed of the initial conquest was striking enough that Claudius was able to cross the Channel later that same year to personally receive the submission of 11 British kings, staging the grand arrival that his political needs required. He spent only a matter of weeks on the island before returning to Rome to celebrate his triumph, a carefully managed performance of imperial victory that served its intended purpose. The legions, including Vespasian and the Legio II Augusta, remained in Britain for years afterward, doing the harder and less celebrated work of consolidating the conquest, pushing the borders further into the English Midlands, and beginning the long process of bringing southern Wales under Roman control. For Vespasian, the British campaign had done something that years of political office could not have done alone. It had given him a military reputation. He had commanded a legion in a major foreign conquest, fought and won against determined opposition across challenging terrain, and demonstrated that he was capable of independent operational command under difficult conditions. These were exactly the qualities that mattered in a Roman world where military credibility was inseparable from political standing. The culmination of everything he had built came in 51 AD, when Vespasian was elected consul. The consulship was the pinnacle of the Roman political career, an office that traced its roots back to the earliest days of the Republic, and that still carried enormous prestige, even in an age when the emperor held ultimate power. There were 2 consuls serving at any given time, elected for the year, and while the office no longer commanded the authority it once had, its symbolic weight remained immense. For a man who had been born to a family of modest equestrian standing, whose father had spent his working life as a tax collector and a moneylender, reaching the consulship was an achievement that spoke for itself. The office also carried a practical reward beyond its ceremonial significance. It was customary for former consuls to be appointed as governors of Roman provinces following their year in office. A provincial governorship was a coveted prize. It placed a man in direct command of military forces, gave him broad administrative authority, and historically had provided opportunities to enrich oneself at the province's expense, within the limits that Roman law and custom permitted. Vespasian had every reason to expect that the consulship would open that door. It did not. In the years immediately following his consulship, Vespasian found himself frozen out. The reason was not his performance in office, nor any professional failure on his part. It was personal. He had fallen out of favor with Claudius, and more significantly with the woman who was becoming the most powerful figure in the imperial court, Agrippina, who was at once Claudius's niece and his wife, and who was steadily consolidating influence over the aging emperor and positioning her son Nero for succession. To be on the wrong side of Agrippina in the early 50s AD was to find doors closing without explanation. Vespasian experienced exactly that. When Claudius died in 54 AD, and it was widely believed, both at the time and by later historians, that Agrippina had poisoned him, her son Nero became emperor at the age of 16. Nero's reign would stretch for nearly 14 years and grow progressively darker as it continued. But in its early stages, it presented Rome with at least the appearance of capable governance. Vespasian, however, had no role in it. With Claudius gone and Agrippina's influence now transferred to the new emperor's court, there was nothing drawing Vespasian back into public life. He withdrew, and for the better part of a decade he remained withdrawn, a former consul, a proven soldier, a man of demonstrated ability, sitting at the margins of Roman public life and waiting. He had climbed a very long way from Phalacrine. He had served in Thrace and in Libya and in Britain. He had held every significant office that a man of his background could aspire to reach, and now in his mid-40s, with a consulship behind him and no province in front of him, the question was whether the climb was finished or simply paused. A man who has spent nearly a decade on the margins of power does not forget what it felt like to be at its center. Vespasian had held the consulship. He had commanded a legion in Britain. He had proven himself capable of things that most men in Rome had never attempted, and yet through the 50s AD he remained largely absent from public life, sidelined by the political currents that surrounded Nero's court. That changed in 59 AD, when Nero made a decision that would alter the atmosphere of Roman politics in ways no one could entirely predict. Nero had his mother killed. Agrippina, the woman who had guided him to the throne and who had spent years positioning herself as the invisible hand behind imperial policy, was murdered on her son's orders, her death driven in large part by the influence of his soon-to-be wife Poppaea. Whatever one makes of the morality of the act, its political consequences were significant. With Agrippina gone, the factional landscape of Nero's court shifted. Those who had been kept at a distance during her years of dominance found that the air had changed. Vespasian was among them. His rehabilitation was not immediate, but it was real. Slowly, after years of waiting, Rome began to have a use for him again. The first concrete sign of that rehabilitation came in 63 AD, when Vespasian was finally granted the provincial governorship that should have followed his consulship more than a decade earlier. The province assigned to him was Africa, a territory that corresponded roughly to modern-day Tunisia and the western portions of Libya. It was not the most prestigious posting Rome had to offer, but after the long drought of the 50s AD, it was a return to relevance. His tenure there, however, did not go smoothly. His rule appears to have generated genuine unpopularity among the provincial population, and the ancient sources record that on at least one occasion the people of the province expressed their displeasure in a manner that was more humiliating than threatening, by pelting him with turnips. His biographer Suetonius, writing in the early 2nd century AD, went further and claimed that Vespasian returned from Africa so financially depleted that he was forced to sell mules to support himself, earning him the nickname the muleteer. It is a colorful story, and it may contain a kernel of truth about the financial disappointments of his governorship, but the detail reads as the kind of embellishment that ancient biographers were rarely able to resist. A man who had been selected shortly afterward to accompany the emperor on an official tour of Greece was clearly not someone who had been reduced to trading livestock. That tour commenced in the autumn of 66 AD, with Nero and his court making their way to Greece and establishing themselves largely at Corinth, the provincial capital. The invitation to join the tour was, in one sense, a mark of continued status. Nero did not bring men of no consequence on his imperial travels. In another sense, it was a peculiar honor, because by 66 AD, the emperor's behavior had become a source of considerable anxiety for those around him. The Roman historians who wrote about his reign describe a man who had grown increasingly disconnected from the responsibilities of governing the largest empire in the Western world, consumed instead by his passion for Greek culture, theatrical performance, and athletic competition. The tour of Greece gave Nero the opportunity to indulge all of these interests simultaneously, and he took full advantage of it. The Olympian Games were among the events on the tour's itinerary, and Nero participated in them. That an emperor would personally compete in public games was unusual enough in itself. That he emerged victorious from every event he entered surprised no one, since no Greek judge in a Roman province was going to declare the emperor of Rome a loser. It was precisely the kind of performance that made serious men uncomfortable, and Vespasian was, above all things, a serious man. His discomfort with the proceedings apparently had physical consequences. During one of Nero's musical performances, and the emperor fancied himself a serious musician as well as an athlete, Vespasian fell asleep. This was not a subtle or easily concealed lapse. He was noticed. The offense of sleeping through the emperor's personal performance was considered significant enough that Vespasian was briefly banished from the court, sent to wait outside Corinth until his transgression was deemed sufficiently atoned for. It was during this period of semi-exile near Corinth that news arrived from the eastern edge of the empire that would redirect the entire course of Vespasian's life. A revolt had broken out in the province of Roman Judea. To understand why that revolt had happened, and why it mattered so profoundly, not just to the Romans but to the entire subsequent history of the Western world, it is necessary to go back considerably further than 66 AD. The land known in Roman times as Judea had been at the crossroads of empires for centuries before Rome ever looked in its direction. It had been conquered by the Babylonians, liberated, conquered again by the Persians, and then absorbed into the vast empire built by Alexander the Great of Macedon. When Alexander's empire fragmented after his death in 323 BC, Judea fell under the control of the Seleucid Empire, one of the successor states that divided up his conquests. It was under Seleucid rule that one of the most consequential episodes in Jewish history took place. In the 2nd century BC, a religious leader named Judas Maccabeus led a revolt against Seleucid authority, driven by the determination to reclaim Jewish religious freedom and political independence. The revolt succeeded. Judas Maccabeus re-established an independent Jewish state in the Holy Land, one that was governed by his descendants for generations to come, and the account of this struggle is preserved in the books of Maccabees in the Old Testament. It was a moment of profound national and religious significance for the Jewish people, a reminder that their identity and their faith were worth fighting for, regardless of the power arrayed against them. But the independence that Judas Maccabeus had won could not survive the arrival of Rome. In the mid-1st century BC, as Rome's power extended across the eastern Mediterranean, the kingdom of Judea came under Roman influence and was eventually reorganized as a client kingdom, ruled by a man named Herod, whom history would know as Herod the Great. Herod was an extraordinary figure, a ruthless political operator, a prolific builder, and a man who understood that survival under Roman dominance required a careful balancing act between satisfying his Roman patrons and maintaining enough legitimacy in the eyes of his own people to keep order. He expanded the temple in Jerusalem into one of the most magnificent structures in the ancient world. He built cities, fortresses, and harbors across his kingdom. He kept Judea stable and prosperous enough that the Romans found him a useful and largely reliable vassal. Herod died around 4 BC, and the fragile equilibrium he had maintained died with him. His kingdom was divided among his sons, none of whom possessed their father's particular combination of ability and political cunning. The arrangement proved unworkable, and in 6 AD, the Romans stepped in directly, abolishing the client kingdom and reorganizing the territory as the Roman imperial province of Roman Judea. Members of the Herodian dynasty were permitted to continue as puppet rulers over portions of the region, maintaining the appearance of local governance while real authority rested with the Roman governor. It was an arrangement that satisfied no one entirely, and it created the conditions for a tension that would smolder for decades. That tension had deep roots in the religious and cultural difference between the Jewish population and their Roman rulers. The Romans governed a vast and diverse empire, and they had considerable experience managing subject peoples with different customs, languages, and traditions. Their general approach was pragmatic: allow local populations to maintain their religious practices and cultural identities so long as they paid their taxes, kept order, and acknowledged Roman authority. This approach worked reasonably well across most of the empire, where the populations they governed were polytheists like the Romans themselves. The Greek gods, the Egyptian gods, the Celtic deities, the Germanic pantheons, these were all different expressions of the same broad religious instinct, with comparable deities appearing under different names across different cultures. The Romans could incorporate foreign gods into their own religious world without difficulty, and subject peoples could reciprocate without feeling that their identity was threatened. Judea was different. The Jewish people were monotheists. They worshipped one God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their faith was not merely a set of rituals or a collection of myths, but the defining foundation of their entire identity as a people. The Torah, the covenant, the temple in Jerusalem, these were not cultural ornaments. They were the substance of Jewish life. Roman religious demands, even when made with no particular hostility, inevitably clashed with a faith that could not accommodate other gods alongside its own. And the Roman habit of requiring symbolic gestures of loyalty to the emperor, who was often treated as a divine figure, created friction that no amount of administrative goodwill could entirely resolve. The province was always difficult to govern, and it required governors of particular sensitivity and political skill to keep it from boiling over. What it received in 64 AD was the opposite of that. A man named Gessius Florus was appointed as Roman governor of Judea, and his conduct in office managed to transform simmering discontent into open rebellion in a remarkably short time. Florus was not merely insensitive, he was provocative, and his provocations were aimed at the things the Jewish population held most sacred. He permitted sacrifices to Roman and Greek gods to be carried out in the vicinity of the temple in Jerusalem, the most holy site in the Jewish world, and in synagogues across the province. He dramatically increased the tax burden on the population and then went a step further, stripping a massive quantity of gold and silver directly from the temple treasury. When prominent members of the Jewish community in Jerusalem came to him to protest these actions, his response was to have some of them flogged and others crucified. The response from the Jewish population was not long in coming. A revolt began in the coastal city of Caesarea in 66 AD, fueled by the accumulated anger of years of Roman misrule and ignited by the specific outrages of Florus's administration. It spread with remarkable speed across the province. Jerusalem itself rose up, and the Roman garrison there was overwhelmed. The city fell to the rebels, and for the first time in decades, Judea was in open, organized revolt against Roman rule. The initial Roman response fell to Cestius Gallus, the governor of the province of Syria to the north of Judea. He assembled a force and marched south to suppress what must have appeared at first to be a manageable provincial uprising. It was not. Gallus advanced toward Jerusalem, assessed the scale of the resistance facing him, and then made the decision to withdraw. That withdrawal turned into a rout, with Jewish forces attacking his retreating column and inflicting significant casualties. The legate of Syria had gone south to put down a rebellion and had returned having made it worse. Rome now needed to send someone more capable. That someone, as it turned out, was the man sitting outside Corinth waiting for permission to rejoin Nero's court. Vespasian was recalled from his semi-exile and given command of the military operation to suppress the Jewish revolt. It was an assignment that carried enormous stakes. Judea was not a peripheral province. Its location at the eastern end of the Mediterranean made it strategically vital, and a prolonged revolt there threatened the stability of Rome's entire Eastern Empire. Whoever succeeded in putting it down would do so with the attention of the entire Roman world fixed upon them. Vespasian moved quickly. He was dispatched to Roman Syria with 2 legions, the Legio X Fretensis and the Legio V Macedonica, and arrived at Ptolemais, the ancient city known today as Acre, in April of 67 AD. There he was joined by an unexpected ally. King Herod Agrippa II, the last of the Herodian dynasty and the Roman puppet king of Judea, had fled the province when Jerusalem fell to the rebels. He now attached himself to Vespasian's command, bringing with him several thousand loyalist Jewish troops who had remained faithful to Rome and to the Herodian-client arrangement. The addition of native troops who knew the terrain, the towns, and the population was not insignificant. Meanwhile, Vespasian's eldest son, Titus, had been in Alexandria in Egypt for several months, preparing his own force. He marched north into the south of the province with the Legio XV Apollinaris, creating a two-pronged approach that would squeeze the revolt from multiple directions simultaneously. When the forces of Vespasian and Titus combined with their auxiliaries and allied troops, the total force under their command numbered more than 50,000 soldiers. It was not an army assembled for a quick police action. It was an army assembled to end a war. The campaign opened in the early summer of 67 AD with an invasion of Galilee, the northern region of the province. The results were swift and decisive. The Romans moved through the region with the methodical efficiency that was the hallmark of their military operations at their best. Several major towns, including Tiberias and Sepphoris, assessed the force arrayed against them and surrendered without offering resistance. Others required direct assault. The sieges of Jodfat and Tarichaea were the most significant engagements of the Galilean campaign, and both ended in Roman victories that demonstrated clearly that the revolt, whatever its initial successes in Jerusalem, could not withstand a properly organized Roman military response in the field. The fall of Jodfat produced one of the most consequential episodes of the entire campaign, though its significance was not military, but intellectual. Among the commanders of the Jewish forces defending the city was a man named Josephus, a member of one of Jerusalem's most prominent and learned families. When Jodfat fell and resistance collapsed, Josephus surrendered himself to Vespasian's forces rather than dying with his comrades. He was taken into Vespasian's entourage, and what followed was a transformation that has fascinated historians ever since. From being one of the leaders of the Jewish revolt against Rome, Josephus underwent a complete change of allegiance. He became an ardent supporter of Roman rule, was eventually granted Roman citizenship, and adopted the name Flavius Josephus in honor of the Flavian family, Vespasian's family, that had become his patrons. He worked alongside Titus as a translator during the subsequent stages of the campaign and eventually accompanied him to Rome. It was there, under the patronage and protection of the Flavian Dynasty, that Josephus produced the body of work that has made him one of the most important writers of the ancient world. His account of the revolt, the Jewish War, is the most detailed eyewitness account of that conflict ever written, and remains one of the most valuable records of any ancient war in existence. His other works, Jewish Antiquities and Against Appian, documented the history, law, philosophy, and culture of the Jewish people in a depth and breadth that no other ancient author approached. None of those works would exist had Josephus not been captured at Jodfat and brought within the orbit of Vespasian's patronage. It is one of the more remarkable ironies of the Jewish war that the man who surrendered rather than fight to the death became, in the end, the most enduring voice of the conflict. Josephus himself recorded that the pacification of Galilee and the surrounding coastal region cost the Jewish population as many as 100,000 dead or enslaved. That figure, like many numbers provided by ancient historians writing about events of great emotional significance to themselves, almost certainly reflects the scale of the catastrophe rather than a literal count. But even discounting the exaggeration, the human cost of the Galilean campaign was enormous. Towns were destroyed, populations displaced, and the northern part of the province was brought under Roman control through sustained and systematic violence. With Galilee largely pacified by the end of 67 AD, Vespasian turned his attention southward. The winter was spent in preparation, securing the Mediterranean coastline and coordinating with Titus's forces from the south. The spring of 68 AD brought a renewed campaign across the central parts of the province. Town after town was brought under Roman control: Jaffa on the coast, Hebron in the south, Ephraim further inland. The geography of the revolt was shrinking with every passing month. Jerusalem remained in rebel hands, and within its walls the situation had grown more complex and more desperate simultaneously. Various Jewish factions had begun fighting among themselves, a consequence of the pressures of siege conditions and the political tensions that had always existed within the revolt's leadership. Some of those who broke with the dominant factions in Jerusalem retreated to other strongholds across the province, among them Masada, an ancient hilltop fortress in the southern desert that would become the final act of the revolt's long conclusion. By the end of 68 AD, the Roman net had drawn tight around Jerusalem. Vespasian and Titus were prepared for the final assault. The city was isolated, its defenders divided, and its population swelling with refugees who had fled the Roman advance across the rest of the province. The siege appeared imminent, the outcome all but certain, and the conclusion of the war seemingly a matter of weeks or months away at most. And then the news arrived from Rome. Nero was dead, the empire was in chaos, and everything that Vespasian had been building toward in Judea suddenly became secondary to a larger question. One that would determine not just the fate of a province, but the fate of the entire Roman world. There are moments in history when the structure of an entire civilization trembles all at once, not gradually, not in the slow way that empires usually decline, but suddenly, visibly, in the space of months. The year 69 AD was one of those moments for Rome. Within the span of a single year, 4 men would claim the title of emperor. 3 of them would die for it. And out of that extraordinary convulsion of violence and ambition, the man from Phalacrine, the son of a tax collector, the soldier who had conquered southwestern Britain and pacified Galilee, would emerge as the ruler of the world. But before any of that could happen, a dynasty had to end. Nero had returned from Greece in the early winter of 67 AD and was back in Rome by January of 68 AD. The empire he returned to was not the same one he had left. The years of erratic governance, the vast expense of his building projects, the alienation of the Senate, and the growing perception that the emperor was more interested in performing on stage than in administering the most powerful state in the Western world had created a reservoir of resentment that was approaching its limits. It took only a single act of open defiance to show how shallow the foundations of his rule had become. That act came from an unexpected quarter. Gaius Julius Vindex was the governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, a province in what is now northern France, and in the early months of 68 AD, he declared himself in revolt against Nero's rule. Vindex was not, by most accounts, a man with imperial ambitions of his own. His grievances appear to have been genuine. He objected to Nero's misrule and the burdens it placed on the provinces, and his goal seems to have been to force a change of emperor rather than to become one himself. His revolt was put down relatively quickly, and Vindex killed himself in its aftermath. But the damage was done. He had demonstrated that a provincial governor with a military force at his disposal could openly challenge the emperor, and that the response of the Roman state was neither swift nor overwhelming. That demonstration was an invitation to others. The most consequential of those others was Servius Sulpicius Galba, the governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, a province covering much of what is now western Iberia. Galba came from one of the most ancient and distinguished senatorial families in Rome, with a pedigree that stretched back centuries and commanded the instinctive respect of both the military and the aristocratic class. When he raised the standard of revolt against Nero, he did so with the credibility that his bloodline and his record of service provided. Support began flowing toward him from across the empire. Then came the moment that decided the question. Gaius Nymphidius Sabinus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, the elite force stationed in and around Rome whose loyalty was essential to any emperor's survival, declared his support for Galba. That was the end. The Senate followed almost immediately, proclaiming Galba as the new emperor of Rome. When the news reached Nero, and he understood that even the soldiers whose specific purpose was to protect him had abandoned his cause, he fled. On the 9th of June 68 AD, the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the lineage that stretched back to Augustus himself, took his own life. He was 30 years old. What happened next revealed something important about the nature of the Roman imperial system that Augustus had constructed. It had no reliable mechanism for succession beyond the will and the capacity of the man currently holding power. Augustus had managed it through careful preparation and the cultivation of an heir over many years. Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero had all succeeded through some combination of family connection and the support of the Praetorian Guard. But when a dynasty ended without a prepared successor, The question of who ruled Rome became, in the most direct sense possible, a military question. The answer would belong to whoever could hold the loyalty of the most soldiers. Galba understood this, which is why one of his first significant acts as emperor was to appoint a man named Vitellius to command the legions stationed on Rome's northern frontier in Germania. It was a decision he would not live long enough to regret. Vitellius was a general of considerable experience and, as events quickly demonstrated, considerable ambition. Within weeks of receiving his appointment, he had turned the very legions Galba had given him against the man who had promoted him, declaring himself emperor and beginning a march southward toward Rome. He was not the only threat Galba faced. Marcus Otho was a man who had been one of Nero's closest friends and most intimate companions. He had watched the succession of events in 68 AD with the calculating attention of someone who understood that in a moment of imperial vacancy, proximity to power and the willingness to act decisively were everything. In January of 69 AD, with Vitellius and his Germanic legions advancing toward Italy, Otho made his move. He persuaded the Praetorian Guard, the same force whose defection had destroyed Nero, to murder Galba. The elderly emperor was killed in the Roman Forum, and Otho stepped forward to claim the throne. In a gesture that speaks volumes about the complex reality of Nero's reputation among the ordinary people of Rome, Otho took the title Nero at the urging of the crowd. The man whom later historians would depict as a universally despised tyrant was apparently remembered rather differently by the citizens who had lived under his rule. It is a detail that ought to give any historian pause before accepting the ancient sources on Nero too uncritically. Otho now held Rome, but Vitellius held an army, and armies in 69 AD were the only currency that ultimately mattered. Otho gathered what forces he could and marched north to confront his rival before Vitellius could reach Italy in full strength. The two armies met at Bedriacum, near the northern Italian city of Cremona, on the 14th of April 69 AD. The battle was an overwhelming victory for Vitellius. Otho's forces were broken. His campaign ended before it had properly begun. 2 days after the defeat, Otho killed himself. He had been emperor for just 95 days. Vitellius entered Rome as the third emperor of 69 AD, and the city that had buried Galba and mourned Otho now received its new master. 3 emperors in less than a year. The pretense that the imperial title was a sacred and stable institution, bestowed by the gods and passed through a legitimate dynasty, had been shattered beyond any easy repair. What 69 AD had revealed, with brutal clarity, was that the emperor of Rome was whoever could take and hold the position by force. That revelation was being watched very carefully by a man on the other side of the empire. Vespasian had followed every development from Judea with the attention of someone who understood exactly what the collapse of the Julio-Claudian dynasty meant. He was in command of the largest single military force anywhere in the Roman world. The legions under his and Titus's combined authority numbered over 50,000 battle-hardened soldiers, an army that had spent 2 years campaigning in Judea and was as experienced and capable a fighting force as existed. He was also the only senior Roman general currently engaged in actively suppressing a major revolt, which meant that his military credibility was not a matter of reputation alone, but of visible, ongoing accomplishment. When Galba was murdered and news of the accelerating chaos in Rome reached Judea, Vespasian made his decision. He did not move impulsively. The decision to claim the imperial title was not one that a cautious and methodical man like Vespasian would have taken without first ensuring that his position was as secure as it could possibly be made. Before he declared himself, he spent weeks building the network of support he would need. The single most important piece of that network was Gaius Licinius Mucianus, the governor of Syria. Syria was the wealthiest and most strategically significant province in the entire Eastern Empire, and Mucianus commanded substantial military forces of his own. Without his support, Vespasian's bid for power would have rested on a narrower foundation than the moment required. With it, he controlled the resources and the military strength of the entire East. Mucianus gave his support, and in early July of 69 AD, Vespasian was proclaimed emperor by the legions under his command. The announcement moved quickly across the eastern provinces. The governors of the Balkan provinces declared for him. The governor of Egypt, controlling the province on which Rome and Italy depended for the bulk of their grain supply, added his endorsement and his forces to Vespasian's cause. Within weeks of the proclamation, Vespasian was not merely a contender for the throne. He was the master of the entire eastern half of the Roman world, with greater military resources and financial reserves at his disposal than Vitellius could readily match. His next move was characteristically strategic. Rather than immediately marching west with his legions to confront Vitellius in a direct military campaign, Vespasian moved to Egypt and took personal control of the province. His purpose was precise and deliberate. Egypt was the breadbasket of the empire. Every year, enormous cargoes of grain sailed from Alexandria to Rome, feeding the city's massive population and maintaining the social stability that cheap food provided. If Vespasian controlled Egypt, he controlled that supply. In a prolonged conflict, the ability to cut off Rome's food would be a weapon of extraordinary power, one that could potentially bring Vitellius's support crumbling without a single battle being fought in Italy. Vespasian was preparing for a long war, and he was securing his most powerful leverage before the fighting began in earnest. He would not need it. While Vespasian consolidated his position in Egypt, the military campaign in the west moved faster than anyone had anticipated, driven largely by the aggressive initiative of one of his generals. Mucianus led the main body of Vespasian's forces westward through the Balkans toward Italy. But it was Marcus Antonius Primus, a general commanding Vespasian's legions from the Danubian provinces, who acted with the kind of bold decisiveness that the moment demanded. Without waiting for authorization from either Vespasian or Mucianus, Antonius Primus moved into northern Italy and engaged Vitellius's forces. He won a series of decisive engagements that shattered the military power supporting Vitellius's claim to the throne. With his army broken and his cause clearly lost, Vitellius attempted to abdicate in favor of Vespasian. He was willing, at the end, to surrender what he had taken. His own supporters were not. The men who had marched from Germania to put Vitellius on the throne, and who had staked their futures on his success, refused to accept the abdication. They fought on, and what followed was one of the ugliest episodes of the entire civil war. Antonius Primus besieged Rome itself. The fighting that erupted within the city was fierce and destructive, and in the course of it some of the most ancient and sacred structures in Rome were damaged or destroyed. The temples and buildings on the Capitoline Hill, the symbolic heart of the Roman state, burned. The physical center of the civilization that had conquered the known world became a battlefield between Roman soldiers fighting for rival claimants to the Roman throne. In the end, Antonius Primus secured the city. Vitellius was found, dragged through the streets, and executed on the 20th of December, 69 AD. He had been emperor for 8 months. The civil war was over, and Vespasian was the undisputed master of Rome. He was still in Egypt when the news arrived. In a gesture that said something meaningful about how he intended to present his rule, Vespasian did not immediately rush to Rome to claim his prize. Instead, he remained in Alexandria long enough to be formally proclaimed emperor in a ceremony at the city's hippodrome, where he received the ancient title of pharaoh. The designation that Egyptian tradition had granted to rulers of that land since the late 4th millennium BC. It was a statement about the breadth and the legitimacy of his authority, a reminder that he did not rule merely by the will of a few legions, but as the successor to a tradition of governance that stretched back thousands of years. He departed Egypt and arrived in Rome by the early summer of 70 AD. But while he had been moving through Alexandria and across the Mediterranean, the war that he had left unfinished in Judea had reached its terrible conclusion. Titus had remained in command of the forces in Judea when his father departed for Egypt, left with a reduced but still substantial military contingent to complete the suppression of the revolt. By the end of 69 AD, Jerusalem was the last major center of resistance remaining. The towns and regions of the province had been brought under Roman control one by one over the preceding 2 years. The Jewish factions inside the city had continued fighting among themselves even as the Roman noose tightened around them, a tragic fragmentation of energy that could only weaken the defense. 3 days before Passover in the year 70 AD, Titus's armies arrived before the walls of Jerusalem and began what would become one of the most devastating sieges in the ancient world. The siege lasted nearly 5 months. Jerusalem in those months was a city in agony. The population inside its walls had swelled enormously as people fled the Roman advance across the rest of the province, and the city that was required to feed and shelter all of those people was simultaneously being strangled from without. Starvation became the Romans' most effective weapon. Josephus, who was present and watching, recorded scenes of desperate suffering within the city that have lost none of their power across 2,000 years of history. His figure of over 1 million dead in the siege is almost certainly a vast exaggeration, as ancient historians routinely inflated casualty figures to convey the magnitude of events they had witnessed. But the true death toll, whatever it was, must have been counted in the tens of thousands, and the suffering of those months was real and profound beyond any easy description. When the Roman forces finally broke through the city's defenses, the destruction that followed was catastrophic. At the center of it all was the temple. The great temple of Jerusalem, rebuilt and expanded by Herod the Great into one of the most magnificent structures in the ancient world, was the heart of Jewish religious and cultural life. It was the place where God and his people met, the physical embodiment of the covenant between the Lord and Israel, the destination of pilgrims from across the Jewish world. In the final days of the siege, it burned. Whether the fire was deliberate Roman policy, the result of the chaos of urban combat, or some combination of both has been debated by historians ever since. What is beyond debate is the consequence. With the destruction of the temple, the Second Temple period of Jewish history, which had begun when the temple was rebuilt after the Babylonian captivity in the 6th century BC, came to an end. It was a wound to the Jewish world that has never entirely healed. Titus left the Legio Ex Fretensis in Judea to deal with the remaining pockets of resistance and departed for Rome with Josephus at his side. The isolated strongholds that still held out, Masada in the southern desert, Herodium in what is now the West Bank, Machaerus in modern-day Jordan, were dealt with over the following years. Masada was the last to fall, finally taken in 73 AD after a long and methodical Roman siege. The defenders there, a Jewish sect known as the Sicarii, chose death over surrender. Rather than face capture and the enslavement that would follow, they killed each other. It was an ending that captured something essential about the nature of the conflict that had consumed Judea for nearly 7 years. The absolute refusal of one side to accept the terms the other was offering, carried to its most extreme and irreversible conclusion. The fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple did not mark the end of Rome's relationship with the Jewish people. It marked the beginning of a new and darker chapter in it. Vespasian and Titus celebrated their victory with a triumph in Rome, a public procession of conquered peoples, looted treasure, and military pageantry that was the traditional Roman method of advertising victory. Among the spoils carried through the streets of Rome were the sacred objects from the temple, including the great menorah, the 7-branched golden lampstand that was one of the most sacred items in the Jewish religious world. The triumph was a statement of Roman power, but it was also a deliberate humiliation of a conquered people and their faith. The policies that followed were punitive in ways that went beyond the normal treatment of a defeated province. The Jews were forbidden from rebuilding the temple. A Roman legion was permanently stationed in Jerusalem, and army veterans were settled in colonies there, a direct physical intrusion into the city that the Jewish people considered most holy. A special tax was imposed on Jews across the entire empire, not just in Judea, but in every province where Jewish communities existed, requiring every Jewish person to pay 2 drachmas annually simply for being Jewish. It was a tax on identity, on faith, on the simple fact of who a person was. Many Jews began leaving Judea in the years that followed, moving to Egypt, to other eastern provinces, to communities in the wider Mediterranean world, in one of the earliest chapters of the long story of the Jewish diaspora. The seeds of further conflict were planted in those policies. 2 more major revolts would follow in the 2nd century AD, one between 115 and 117 AD that engulfed much of the eastern Mediterranean, and another between 135 and 137 AD known as the Third Jewish Revolt. The legislation and the attitudes toward the Jewish people that first took systematic form under Vespasian's rule have been identified by scholars as among the earliest roots of an antipathy that would cast a long and terrible shadow across the subsequent centuries of Western history. Vespasian stood in Rome in the summer of 70 AD as undisputed emperor, the civil war behind him, the Jewish revolt effectively concluded, the fires of the Capitoline Hill extinguished, and the machinery of the Roman state back in his hands. He had come from nothing. He had built everything through service, through competence, through the slow accumulation of military and political experience across 4 decades of Roman public life. And now the work of governing what he had won lay ahead of him. Rome in the summer of 70 AD was a city carrying the weight of a decade of damage. The Great Fire of 64 AD had consumed enormous portions of the city, and Nero's response to that destruction had been to clear the ruined land for a vast personal palace complex rather than to rebuild what had been lost. The civil war that had ended just months earlier had added fresh wounds. Temples burned, buildings destroyed, the Capitoline Hill scarred by fighting between Roman soldiers who should never have been pointing weapons at each other. The treasury was depleted. The legions needed to be paid and kept loyal. The Senate needed to be managed. The provinces needed to be governed. And the man who had just spent 2 years fighting a war in Judea and the better part of a year navigating a civil war was now responsible for all of it. Vespasian arrived in Rome by early summer and went to work without ceremony. His first priority was financial. The empire's treasury had been drained by Nero's extravagances, by the cost of the civil war, and by years of administrative neglect. Vespasian understood, with the practical clarity of a man who had spent his early career watching his father work as a tax collector, that none of the rebuilding he intended to undertake was possible without a sound financial foundation. He increased taxation across Rome and the provinces, imposing new levies and reviving old ones that had fallen into disuse. The money raised went directly toward 2 purposes: paying the legions that had brought him to power and funding the reconstruction of the empire's physical and civic infrastructure. The payments to the military were not merely a reward, they were a statement. A soldier whose wages arrived reliably and on time had less reason to listen to anyone who came promising a better deal under a different emperor. He was not alone in managing the immediate demands of the new reign. Gaius Licinius Mucianus, the governor of Syria, whose support had been the single most important factor in Vespasian's ability to win the civil war, occupied an extraordinary position in the early years of the Flavian administration. Mucianus had effectively governed the western provinces from Rome during the period when Vespasian was still in Egypt consolidating his control, and his influence over the machinery of government remained immense after Vespasian's arrival. Some classical scholars have described him as an informal co-ruler, and the evidence supports that description. He was appointed consul in 70 AD and again in 72 AD, holding the empire's highest political office twice in 3 years. He is believed to have boasted at some point after the civil war that he had, in his own words, bestowed the sovereignty upon Vespasian. That is, that he had made Vespasian emperor. Whether or not those words were spoken in precisely that form, they reflected a reality that Vespasian was too pragmatic to dispute. Mucianus fades from the historical record after 72 AD, and it is likely that illness took him sometime in the mid-70s. Until that point, the governance of the empire bore the imprint of 2 minds working in close coordination. Not all of the fires that needed to be put out were metaphorical. While the main drama of 69 AD had played out in Italy and the East, a revolt had broken out in the northwest that required immediate military attention. The Batavi were a Germanic people who had long inhabited the region at the mouth of the River Rhine, in what is now the Netherlands, and who had a tradition of service in the Roman auxiliary forces. Their leader, a man named Gaius Julius Civilis, whose thoroughly Roman name revealed how deeply his people had been integrated into Roman military culture, had taken advantage of the chaos of the civil war to raise a revolt in the summer of 69 AD. Inspired by the memory of Arminius, the German warlord who had famously destroyed 3 Roman legions in 9 AD and pushed Rome back behind the Rhine, Civilis had managed to defeat and nearly destroy 2 Roman legions before the civil war concluded, and Rome's full attention could be directed toward him. Vespasian's response was overwhelming. He dispatched 8 legions northward under his son-in-law Quintus Petilius Carialis. a force that effectively outnumbered the entire Batavian population. Civilis's revolt, which had never succeeded in attracting the broad alliance among Germanic tribes that would have been needed to sustain it, was crushed. A Roman legion was permanently stationed thereafter at Novi Omegus, the site of the modern-day Dutch city of Nijmegen, ensuring that the northern frontier remained secure and that no future opportunist could repeat the experiment. The physical rebuilding of Rome was one of the defining achievements of Vespasian's reign, and he approached it with the same methodical determination that had characterized his military campaigns. The destruction left behind by the Great Fire and the Civil War was extensive, and Nero's decision to treat the cleared land as a private building site rather than a resource for the city had left large portions of Rome's center vacant and its former residents homeless. Vespasian reversed that policy directly, announcing that anyone displaced by the fire was free to occupy vacant land and build on it. It was a practical solution that accelerated reconstruction by distributing the work across thousands of individual builders rather than concentrating it in a single imperial project. And it repopulated and revitalized parts of the city that had stood empty for years. At the same time, he undertook a series of major public building projects that were intended to restore the civic and religious heart of the city. The Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, was among the oldest and most sacred structures in Rome, a building whose history stretched back to the earliest centuries of the city and whose destruction in the fighting of 69 AD had been experienced as something close to a sacrilege. Vespasian rebuilt it. He also erected a Temple of Peace adjacent to the Forum, a structure that served both as a religious monument and as a repository for the treasures brought back from Judea, including the sacred objects from the Jerusalem Temple. A temple in honor of the Emperor Claudius, which Nero had neglected and partially dismantled, was rebuilt on the Caelian Hill. But the building project that would outlast every other achievement of Vespasian's reign, and indeed outlast the Roman Empire itself, began around 72 AD on a piece of land that Nero had earmarked for his own personal palace. On that ground, Vespasian ordered the construction of what Romans called the Flavian Amphitheater, and what the world has known for 15 centuries as the Colosseum. It was built on a scale that announced its purpose unmistakably. The structure rose to nearly 50 meters in height. Its elliptical interior could accommodate more than 50,000 spectators, arranged across 3 tiers according to the strict hierarchy of Roman social class: patricians and senators in the lower tiers, equestrians above them, the common people higher still. It was built with travertine limestone, volcanic rock, and Roman concrete, and the labor that raised it was provided largely by the tens of thousands of Jewish slaves brought back from Judea in the aftermath of the revolt. The connection between the destruction of Jerusalem and the construction of Rome's greatest monument was not coincidental. The wealth plundered from Judea funded the building, and the people enslaved there built it. Vespasian did not live to see its completion. That honor fell to his son Titus, who dedicated the Colosseum in 80 AD with 100 days of games that later accounts describe as spectacular, beyond any previous public entertainment in Roman history. The practical and sometimes colorful details of Vespasian's administration have given later historians considerable material to work with. Among the more memorable is the tax he imposed on the collection and sale of urine. This requires a moment of explanation. Urine was a commodity of genuine commercial value in the ancient Roman world. The ammonia it contains makes it effective for a range of industrial processes. It was used in the dyeing of cloth, in the tanning of leather, and as a cleaning agent capable of removing stubborn stains from fabric. Urine was collected from the public bathrooms distributed across Rome and sold to workshops that relied on it for these purposes. Nero may have introduced some form of tax on this trade, but it was Vespasian who imposed it systematically and who became so closely associated with it that the tax became one of the defining anecdotes of his reign. When his son Titus reportedly objected to the undignified nature of the revenue source, Vespasian is said to have held up a coin and asked whether it smelled. The story captures something essential about the man: pragmatic, unsentimental, and entirely unbothered by what the refined might find beneath his dignity. The memory of that tax proved unexpectedly durable. When public bathrooms were introduced in Paris in the 19th century, they were called Vespasienne, and in Rome they were called Vespasiano. both names offered in his somewhat ambiguous honor. Vespasian's investment in education was driven by motivations that were simultaneously cultural and administrative. He established set salaries for teachers of Latin, Greek, and rhetoric across the empire, creating for the first time a professional class of educators who were compensated by the state rather than dependent entirely on private patronage. The goal was practical as much as it was idealistic. A well-educated population of administrators and officials was essential to the effective governance of an empire as vast and complex as Rome's, and Vespasian understood that the machinery of imperial administration required a steady supply of capable, literate, rhetorically trained men to keep it functioning. Among those who benefited from this cultural environment was Quintilian, a rhetorician from Spain whose school flourished during Vespasian's reign, and who was elevated to the consulship by the emperor in the 70s AD. Quintilian's work on the training of the orator became one of the foundational texts of Western education for centuries after his death. Pliny the Elder, one of the most industrious scholars of the ancient world, was appointed procurator by Vespasian as early as 70 AD, a position that gave him both financial security and the time to continue the encyclopedic work he had been compiling for years. His Natural History, completed in the 70s AD, was a staggering attempt to gather and systematize all known human knowledge about the natural world: plants, animals, minerals, geography, astronomy, and much else besides. It stands as one of the most ambitious intellectual projects of antiquity, and it was produced under the patronage of the Flavian administration. In Britain, the slow work of consolidating Rome's hold on the island continued throughout Vespasian's reign. In 77 AD, he appointed Gnaeus Julius Agricola as governor of the province and tasked him with extending Roman authority into the remaining unconquered territories. Agricola campaigned through northern Wales the following year, completing the conquest of the Ordovices and securing the island of Anglesey, and then turned his attention northward, pushing Roman forces into the Scottish lowlands for the first time. The island that Vespasian himself had helped conquer as a young legate of the Legio II Augusta 3 decades earlier was being brought further under Roman control by his own appointment, a symmetry that the emperor may have appreciated. Those who knew Vespasian personally, or who recorded accounts of his character, paint a consistent picture. He was not a man who had forgotten where he came from. Despite having risen to the pinnacle of the Roman world, he retained the directness and the lack of pretension that had characterized him throughout his life. He was known for a dry and self-deprecating sense of humor that expressed itself at unexpected moments. He was generous with his own resources toward members of the patrician and equestrian classes who had fallen on hard times, providing financial support to families of distinguished lineage who could no longer maintain the standard of living their social position required. For a man who had spent his career climbing into the world of the Roman elite from below, there was something deliberately generous about that particular habit. He was not, however, a man without edges. He had no patience for philosophers whose intellectual positions extended to challenging the legitimacy of imperial authority. Several philosophers who questioned the right of any single man to hold absolute power over the Roman world were expelled from Rome during his reign. He also revived laws that made it an offense to advocate for the restoration of the Republic, a form of political speech that had continued to circulate in Roman intellectual circles long after the Republic itself had become a memory. Vespasian was willing to tolerate a great deal, but he had not fought a civil war to see his authority undermined by men with theories. His management of his public image was sophisticated and deliberate. He issued coins bearing his profile in greater numbers than emperors of comparable reigns had done before him, ensuring that his face circulated across the empire in the hands of ordinary people going about their daily lives. He also actively publicized a series of divine omens and miraculous signs that were presented as evidence of heavenly favor toward his rule. Suetonius and Cassius Dio both recorded accounts of these omens, which included reports that Vespasian had performed miraculous healings in Alexandria before his departure for Rome. Whether Vespasian believed in these signs himself, or whether he understood them as instruments of political communication, is impossible to know with certainty. What is clear is that he used them, and that they served their intended purpose. The three ancient sources through which we know Vespasian most directly all carry their own particular biases, and those biases are worth holding in mind. Tacitus, whose histories provide some of the most detailed accounts of the period, belonged to a noble family that had been restored to prominence under Vespasian's patronage, and his father-in-law had been appointed governor of Britain by the emperor. His gratitude, however subtle, colors his account. Suetonius served emperors Trajan and Hadrian, both of whom had come to power through merit rather than hereditary succession, and both of whom had political reasons to present the hereditary Julio-Claudian rulers who preceded Vespasian in an unflattering light. And Josephus, whose account of the Jewish War is the most detailed record of Vespasian's military campaign in Judea, owed his freedom, his Roman citizenship, and his entire literary career to Flavian patronage. None of these men was dishonest in any simple sense, but none of them was without a position, and their positions shaped what they chose to record and how they chose to record it. By the late 70s AD, Vespasian was approaching 70 years of age. He had outlived his wife. His sons were grown and capable. The empire he had inherited in chaos was functioning. The city he had inherited in ruin was being rebuilt. The treasury he had inherited empty was recovering. He had done what he came to do. In the final months of his life, he returned to the region where he had been born, to the countryside northeast of Rome that he had left as a young man with a military commission and modest prospects. He was suffering from an intestinal disorder that had worsened over time, aggravated, according to Suetonius, by an excessive habit of taking cold baths that his physicians could not persuade him to abandon. The illness progressed, and it became clear that the end was approaching. When the moment came, Vespasian reportedly felt himself weakening and insisted on being helped to stand. He had not spent 69 years moving forward only to face the end lying down. According to Suetonius, his last words were these: "An emperor should die on his feet." He died in the arms of those who were supporting him on the 23rd or 24th of June in the year 79 AD. He was 69 years old. The Senate deified him almost immediately, in accordance with the tradition that had grown around the deaths of emperors who were judged to have served Rome well. The man from Phalacrine, the son of a tax collector who had worked in provincial Turkey, and a moneylender who had operated among the Swiss, the boy educated on a Tuscan estate by his grandmother, the soldier who had crossed the English Channel and fought his way across southwestern Britain, the general who had broken the Jewish revolt and walked through the chaos of the year of the four emperors to claim the throne of the world, was declared a god by the Roman Senate and took his place among them. "Hey, mortals,